Sir C. Raja Mohan, former Air Chiefs, serving military and civilian officers, veterans, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening and welcome to this February evening lecture. Happy to see most of the Air Force logged in, and I hope you all are safe and keeping warm. In our continuing efforts at the Center for Air Power Studies to discuss and generate a healthy debate on critical issues related to India's national security, we present to you our next speaker of the Eminent Speaker Series. We are happy to have with us Mr. Professor C. Raja Mohan. Professor Raja Mohan is one of India's leading commentators on India's foreign policy. He is a visiting research professor at the Institute of South Asian Studies, Singapore, and till recently was the director of the same institute from May 2018 to December 2021. He was professor of South Asian Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi and at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technology University, Singapore. He's been associated with a number of think tanks in New Delhi, including the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis, the Center for Policy Research, and the Observer Research Foundation. He's also the founding director of Carnegie India, New Delhi, the 6th International Center of Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Washington, D.C. He held the Henry Alfred Kissinger Chair in International Affairs at the United States Library of Congress, Washington, D.C. from 2009 to 2010. Mohan was a member of the India's National Security Advisory Board during 1998 to 2000 and again from 2004 to 2006. He's led the India chapter of the Pugwash conferences on science and world affairs from 1999 to 2006. He writes regularly columns for Indian Express and was earlier the strategic affairs editor for the Hindu newspaper. He is on the editorial boards of a number of Indian and international journals on world politics. Professor Mohan has a master's degree in nuclear physics and PhD in international relations. His books include Crossing the Rubicon, The Shaping of India's Foreign Policy, 2004, Impossible Allies, Nuclear India, United States and the Global Order, 2006. His most recent work is Samudra Manthan, Sino-Indian Rivalry in Indo-Pacific, 2013. And Modi's work, Expanding India's Sphere of Influence, 2015. He's also been awarded the highest French distinction of Chevalier de Légion d'Honneur, or the Knight of the Legion of Honor in 2006. Areas of his interest and expertise: India's foreign policy, Asian security, great power relations, international politics of technology. His foreign policy perspective is broadly liberal and pragmatist, arguing for closer ties between India and key global players such as the United States, Russia, and China. He once argued for using greater economic linkages to improve India's troubled ties with Pakistan. He said for long, Delhi has viewed its regional policy through the prism of security without references to the economic interests of the people. Delhi should instead focus on modernizing the national security management and bringing it in line with the demands of the globalizing economy. He has chosen today to speak on a subject where a lot of action is unfolding. He'll be talking on India's and the new geopolitics of outer space. We couldn't have had a more eminent person with a combination of masters in nuclear physics and a PhD in international relations. At the end of this talk, there will be a question-answer session. I request you all to put your questions in the chat box. Air Marshal Gulani, Additional Director General of CAPS, will coordinate the question and answer session. So now, over to Professor Raja Mohan. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for that generous introduction. It's really a pleasure to be with you this evening. It's a special pleasure for me to be with the CAPS, given my long personal association with it. And it's a privilege to deliver the Eminent Person's lecture this afternoon. So let me begin by just a word about my personal connection to CAPS. Commodore Jasjit Singh, who founded this institute, and I had joined the Institute of Defense Studies just within 2 days of each other, and we had our rooms next to each other. And when he joined, he was working on air power, writing a series of essays on lessons from air power for India. And I was just out of the university, beginning to work on the politics of technology at the global level. We became, very close, both as colleagues, as professionals, as well as at the personal level. And I was quite closely associated with him during his directorship of the IDSA. And later, when he started the CAPS in 2001, in fact, for a short while, we shared the office space when I was heading Pugwash, and he was launching CAPS in a small place in Vasant Enclave. Jasjit had a deep attachment to the study of air power. And I think with it came naturally, I would think, a great interest in space-related issues. So I think it's really what we've seen, I think, since the time CAPS has been set up, as the DG said just now, the importance of outer space, both in the commercial as well as in the strategic domain, has dramatically increased, and it's growing by leaps and bounds. My own sense is that today this subject remains understudied and under-researched. CAPS does some work. There are a few others here and there. But I think given the scale of the importance of outer space, the relevant intellectual effort, I think we still need to match the demand of the time and putting more effort into this. And I believe CAPS is the best placed institution today to lead a vigorous national debate on India's geopolitical challenges in outer space. So that brings me to the actual structure of what I want to do this evening. I know, speaking about outer space to Air Force officers and veterans, there is always the danger of taking cold to Newcastle. We don't have to speak about, that you have an audience, is a choir that's already converted. So one doesn't need to preach to the choir on the importance of the space. So I don't propose to go into a spate of technical and political developments that are unfolding in outer space today. Now, would I go into the history of how space has evolved and how the strategic dimension of space has emerged in recent years? What I would like to do instead in the next 30 odd minutes or so is to lay out a set of antinomies, I say precisely a set of 10 antinomies or contradictions or tensions, whichever way you define, that India must address in seeking a better place for itself in the rapidly changing geopolitics of outer space. So focusing on these 10 contradictions, if you will, I think it's a good way of reflecting on potentially an Indian strategy in outer space. So therefore, I thought it'll be using this to some clear set of propositions, which can be basis for our discussion and debate. I also believe this is not a lecture in that sense. It's more, I would like to learn as much from you as professionals who look at aerospace power, understand how you look at the changes that are taking place. So I look forward to a very interactive session on this evening, rather than a one-way talk from one speaker to a large audience. So let me begin by looking at these 10 contradictions. The first is for a developing country like India, seeking advanced technologies, going back to the 1950s, there was always this question, should India devote its resources to advanced technology, or should it focus on the basic needs of the people? And this contradiction, continues out there in different forms, though India is a much more developed country. It's the 6th largest economy today. But most of you would recall the notorious cartoon in the New York Times when India launched its Mangalyaan mission in 2014, showing an Indian peasant with a cow in tow knocking at the door of the elite space club. the image of India, a developing country trying to gate crash into the space club. That again, I mean, I think New York Times had to apologize for the condescension that it showed. But I think this problem that advanced technology in a emerging society, I think that problem remains. And if you remember, one of the early images of India's space program was about this young scientist from ISRO carrying a rocket on the back of his bicycle towards the Tumba Rocket Launch Center. I mean, that's a famous photograph that many of you might have seen it. I mean, that told you kind of the humble beginnings at which, and the kind of odds at which with India began its space program. But I think this question, I mean, was not just that the New York Times or international community saying, look, why is India putting its money in nuclear and space technologies? It should be focusing on food and drinking water for its people. That argument had a strong resonance within India. I think many people objected to Nehru's investment in space and nuclear technologies. And many said, look, this is really a waste of money, that India doesn't really need this. But I think what it pointed to was one of the enduring contradictions about India. India was getting Nobel Prizes in physics as early as 1930, when you had Sir C.V. Raman get the Nobel Prize for physics. That India had already developing a natural talent and capability to do modern sciences. But yet the state of Indian society in the early 20th century meant the contradiction between pursuing advanced technologies and the poverty and underdevelopment in the country was a contradiction that continues to manifest itself. Whether it is posed, for example, in the defense expenditure, guns versus butter, or advanced technology versus development, has been a contradiction that has been around for a long time. In retrospect, though, and I would say it was a wise investment, because India did not really invest too much massive amounts of money, and it is widely acclaimed as the most effective program for the money that was spent. I mean, that it was one of the most frugal but most successful space programs the world has seen, and that it has allowed India to get a foot into the door when outer space was just emerging as an arena for development. Today, what we're seeing is actually there are many more countries today, at least scores of countries today are active in outer space. And the space is no longer an exclusive preserve of a few countries. And this is the first takeaway I want to present to you. Outer space has been democratized. That even India need not preen itself that it does more things, but just have to look at the kind of things North Korea does, what Iran does. So you don't need to be very, very smart to actually do things in space. So therefore, the space is going to be seeing a democratization, and with it, a crowding, an overcrowding, if you will, in outer space. So space is going to get to be a larger number of countries participating in it and crowding it up. So therefore, the quality of our program needs special attention, and what we do with the space program is going to be far more consequential than merely saying we are there, we are an important space actor in the international system. The second tension, I would say, is the developmentalism versus commercialism. Because of this pressure saying, why is a poor country doing science, advanced science and technology? There was great pressure on the Indian scientific community to constantly show relevance to the developmental needs. So therefore, you had all kinds of things the scientific departments had to do. DRDO was doing things which should not have been doing, because the pressure to show we are also contributing to the development. Department of Atomic Energy constantly advertises what it is doing for agriculture and other things. And the space in particular had to constantly show that it was part of India's developmental effort. You remember the early space program was focused on community television. I mean, you're talking about the 1960s and the early 70s, using it for agriculture, using it for learning. So this focus on development, that space technology was an agent of development, meant ignoring the commercial damage. I mean, I'm not saying it was anybody's fault, but I think given the circumstances in which the space program emerged, so the focus on developmentalism, and developmentalism led by a department of the government, gave it a particular character in which the commercial domain had very little relevance. It's not that the space program mobilized a number of private actors to support its program, but the purpose was really focused on developmentalism as a way of promoting India's development, rather than seeing the longer term. That today, what was seen as a developmental dimension 30 years ago, once you had the mobile phone, which uses satellite communication, what you can do with it is 1,000 times more than what you could have done by setting up small rural community televisions. So I think it is that dimension which today looms large, and which we need to adapt to, that the dramatic expansion of the private sector in space that is emerging. That is the second takeaway I want to present to you. And if you go back to our own aerospace program, HAL, for example, was a partnership between Maharaja of Mysore, Bhalchand Hirachand, and William Pauly, an American engineer, who set up HAL in 1940. But the post-independence focus on nationalization meant there was no room for the private sector. It has really taken us 30 odd years of reforms from 1991 to talk about private sector's role in outer space, which is what the Prime Minister has done in the last 2 years. But we have a long way to go, because it's still a department holding hands rather than opening it up fully. We'll see the extent to which, it's, as you all know, you all serve in the government, not easy to break monopolies. Whether actually ISRO will let go, whether the space law that is under consideration will actually give significant room for the private sector. Those are big issues. I mean, I think those issues have not been debated adequately in terms of what kind of a space law do we need and what would be the role of the private sector given where the rest of the world is going. That, I think, is a huge requirement for us today. That brings me to the third set of contradictions. I mean, we talked about developmentalism. Developmentalism, as you all know, could also become departmentalism. That every department in the government, I mean, rarely wants to cede its turf. And the scientific departments in India have acquired a very particular power that is probably unprecedented in comparison to what the other departments have. The original model of Bhabha flying in from Bombay, having a direct access to Nehru, and the two of them deciding what to do with the atomic energy program, and the space program was very much part of it. So this dynamic interaction between the political leadership and the scientific leadership, really at incubating a new program within India, eventually transformed into political deference to the so-called scientists, in quotations I'm putting. That is, the parliament, the political leadership steadily ceded any responsibility for deciding the nature and direction of the space program. So it's really became an autonomous enterprise. This is not, again, not a criticism, but that's kind of fact that has emerged, where the DAE, the Department of Space, and the DRDO tended to run the thing as their own enterprise. And I think leaving little room for collective focus on what kind of priorities So the question is, for example, who is deciding what is important? Should we focus on the moon or should we focus on the Mars? Do we do it on both? Do we prioritize manned missions in outer space? Or do you focus on military program? So who is deciding these priorities? You barely see a debate. That the Space Department largely sets the priorities, the political leadership defers to those priorities, and there is very little debate. But now I think, given the expansion of the stakeholders, given the external impact of what is happening in the world, certainly in relation to China, I mean, you just had to read the latest Chinese white paper on outer space, which had just come a week ago, that you see the scale at which developments are taking place. So therefore, for us, I think we need a space program that meets the interests of all the relevant stakeholders. That includes the Air Force, that includes the military, that includes the private sector, and that this must be a national enterprise. And it can no longer be a departmental enterprise, narrowly run by a small department, but that it must be able to meet the interests of everyone, rather than focusing on what they think is important. I'm saying they're all brilliant people, but what we need is then, given the developments that are taking place in space commerce and in military space, we need a much greater debate in terms of how and in what form do we take our space program forward? That brings me to the fourth set of issues, which is really, are we doing space program for prestige? I mean, if you go back to the early literature on India's space program, it was a talk was always about prestige, that India can do it. Remember, we used to call, what did we call it? So-called peaceful nuclear explosion in 1974. What did we call it? It's a technology demonstrator. We can do it. Because 30 years, we didn't do anything about it. But the fact is, we did a test and said, yeah, we are capable, we're a nuclear capable country, but didn't really build a nuclear arsenal well into the late 80s. So this idea that technology is for demonstration, to demonstrate, to visibly show India is capable, but not following through logically what you got to do with this technology in relation to what the rest of the world was doing. And I think that was a problem. You remember, those of you old enough to remember, Agni missile, when we first did it, we called it a technology demonstrator. It was not part of the Air Force's arsenal. It was not part of your nuclear deterrent, but it was just a demonstrator. So I think this circumstance of demonstrating technologies, but not fully taking them to the scale and the full use at which they can be put. And the celebration, I mean, often we pat ourselves on the back for our frugal innovation. But frugal innovation is great if you're operating on limited resources. But where is the scale? That today's scale is so critical. I mean, as we're beginning to discover, whether it is small-scale industries or large-scale space program, that without scale, what you do will always be suboptimal. For example, if you launch a mission to Mars once in 5 years, I mean, that's not going to get you anywhere. Or your Chandrayaan missions, the second one failed. I mean, you keep moving it, okay, another 6 years between two missions. Well, you see the Chang'e missions of China. I mean, I think it's like a program that runs almost every year. They're launching another moon mission. So the scale becomes critical to be able to achieve real goals in outer space. For example, I mean, that is it just about dropping a small payload on moon? I mean, that didn't succeed for whatever reasons, but that's not the issue. But the fact is, but this was something the Russians and the Americans were doing it in the 60s. So is it just to demonstrate I can put a 1-ton payload on the moon? Or do you use the resources to wider ends? I mean, so I think here again, the focus on prestige, India can, yes, land on the moon, 6th country to do it. But the first country and second country did it in the 1960s. So I think we need to take prestige out of the equation and relate our capabilities to scale and to larger national objectives, rather than merely doing it to show we can do it. That we need to get full practical results out of the capacities that we have by giving it scale and integrating it into larger national goals. That brings me to the fifth set of issues, which is really, is this about the flag? That is this a national program? Or do we also emphasize international cooperation? That is, today, for example, in the moon, Russia and China working together, they're going to soon set up a major lunar base. America has its own mission called Lunar Gateway. What they're doing is really to have an orbiter around the moon, then use that as a launching pad to get larger and larger payloads getting onto the surface of the moon. So there is a collective enterprise that is being built. So the question then becomes, are we just going to do small scale program to demonstrate capability? Or do we work with others to get a greater bang for our resources that we put in? I think this is a big question. I mean, I think if you go back to the beginnings of the space program or even the atomic energy program, India benefited massively from external cooperation with the US, with mostly Western countries, that is US, France, Canada, and a whole lot of others on the nuclear side, and the space, similar actors. But after we got into trouble with the non-proliferation regime after the 1974 test, and we became isolated. We turned to the Soviet Union for a little bit from the 1980s. But overall, your ability to cooperate with the others rapidly declined because the rest of the world was trying to squeeze or program in the name of non-proliferation, and we were isolated for a long time. So therefore, there was a logic in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s to say, look, you have no room for collaboration. Therefore, you do purely a national program within the resources that you have, within the frugal innovation that you can demonstrate. You try and do as smart things as possible. But India is out of that box, which it found itself in the 1970s. India is a member of the missile technology control regime now. A large part of the restrictions have gone, and the rest of the world is increasingly interested in collaborating with us, which also means that you get others capital. For example, small country like the UAE, and you look at Prime Minister Modi. He went to UAE in 2015. August, if I recall right, if you read the joint statement, UAE is saying, look, we're ready to put money into your space program. We're ready to work with you. We can bring the money. You have the technology. Can we do something together? Singapore has been looking for collaboration with India to develop a space program of their own. But India is just not able to meet the demands for cooperation, whether the country is stronger than us or country is weaker than us, that we're not able to use our capabilities to boost them through international cooperation. And the focus remains largely on a national program, rather than working with others to achieve national goals. So this, I think, is an important takeaway, and I want to emphasize this, that while we need to build national capabilities, it's only national capabilities that will give us respect in terms of our leverage for partnership with other countries. But we must continue to use external partnerships to strengthen our own capabilities. And I think that's where the balance between purely national and an international program. And I think that's where the challenges are. And hopefully the doors are much more open today for India. And there are other countries, other private sector, other state governments are willing to put more money into India's space sector. And whether we can take full advantage of that remains to be seen. That brings me to the sixth set of issues, which is on the peaceful versus military uses of space. I mean, of course, you remember the great Indian rhetoric. Our nuclear program is entirely for peaceful purposes. Even after we did the first nuclear test in '74, the Indian diplomats would always say, in Geneva, that we are for disarmament, we are for complete elimination of nuclear weapons. We don't want space weapons. We want to see space used only for peaceful purposes. Now, sometimes diplomats are paid to do propaganda, to set up larger goals. But if you start believing in this rhetoric yourself, because right from the beginning of the space age, the militarization of outer space was very much part of the development of space capabilities. Initially, it was passive militarization. During the Cold War, the Americans and the Russians used space to observe each other's nuclear programs, to gather intelligence, what used to be called the national technical means. So space was very much a military domain, but a passive military domain until recently. Nevertheless, it was a military domain. But yet India's public emphasis, both at the political level and at the diplomatic level, remained that we call for disarmament. We call for, demilitarization of space. We call for abolition of nuclear weapons. This kind of rhetoric was internalized, I believe, including in our own space program, that, look, their job was to do the peaceful stuff and that there was no room for military program. And I think it took a lot of effort, and therefore all of you would know that it's only in the last 15 odd years that really India begins to develop space capabilities for military uses. Now we have a defense space agency, but the scale of India's military, in fact, there is no acknowledgement of the need for a military space program or a serious institutional structures that can develop a military space program. Now, I don't understand why this shyness, because everybody else, particularly at a time when you have countries setting up space forces, where all major air forces today have expanded to cover, what's called Space Force. I don't know, some of you would have seen that comic serials called Space Force, which is funny, but okay. But the fact is, countries are doing it. That there are space forces being set up, but here the hesitation to get into recognizing, acknowledging, and underlining the need for an Indian military space program, I think is so critical, but we are not there yet in terms of formalizing the goals and say, look, I mean, why the government should be saying, this is what's happening in the rest of the world in the military space. We are moving from passive militarization to potentially active militarization. We did a ISAT test like the others, but the scale of, for example, if you use satellites to attack other satellites, to use satellites to do all kinds of new things that are beginning to happen. Now, if that is the new domain that we're going to see, but someone should actually make the case for India needs a military space program. The contours of it we can dip into. That was the second stage of the debate. But I think we need the debate to make the case where the rest of the world is headed, including our adversaries. I don't know how many of you have seen recent Chinese decision. In fact, even that report that has been published, they're going to set up a space center in Pakistan. They already, on the commercial side, Chinese have this space Silk Road, or the digital Silk Road, which is really connecting their space assets, their digital domain together to offer services to all our neighbors. We can pat ourselves on the back for our South Asia satellite, the one diplomatic instrument we tried. But the scale of China's digital Silk Road, which includes both the space and the electronic dimensions, of integrating our neighbors into their space and digital networks. All this is unfolding, both civilian, military, and together, and that the scale of this challenge, I mean, we've not begun to debate, and I think we need to begin that serious consideration that what is happening in military space around us, and what are within that, we can't do everything. What are the priorities for us becomes a very, very critical and urgent task, partly for you and all of you, for Air Force professionals. Aerospace comes naturally to you, and I think we need to begin that debate somewhere, and I hope CAPS can be the one that's going to launch it. That brings me to the seventh set of issues, which is really assuming, okay, space, we need a military force. What kind of strategy, or how is space emerging as a domain that, just like the maritime domain 300 years ago, as it became from being a kind of a unapproachable territory, nobody went into the high seas, to one today, I mean, it's central to global commerce. The space is going through a similar transformation on the commercial side. But what will it be in the military domain? There are fascinating conceptions of what space ought to be, at least in the US and China and other places. Is space a high ground that a powerful country would want to capture and gain military advantage from this high ground? Or do you say, look, space is too fragile for any high ground, and what you need is actually a common set of arms control or disarmament, whatever measures that you need to construct, so that everybody has some stake in this. So I think this debate is not resolved. Is it going to be the mighty and the powerful are going to greater control of outer space, or is it going to be left as either as a no man's land, like the high seas, which are supposed to be common for everyone, or does it become a contested zone? Is a big debate, and I think that debate will gather ground as the space capabilities of US and China and the US-China competition begins to unfold. This, I think, which is many of you would have heard of integrated deterrence, which is the new strategic concept the US is developing in dealing with China in the Indo-Pacific. The integrated deterrence then is not just about, it's about connecting your capabilities across the full spectrum: land, sea, air, cyber, and outer space. So in a sense, you see the outer space becoming very much part of the deterrent equations today, and that this will be with us. And this is, again, something I would say we need to debate, that what ought to be. I mean, it's not what we do tomorrow, but the aerospace professionals in the country should be thinking, look, what is the nature of the evolution of the space as a domain? What is it that we would like to see everything you want is not going to come. Space is not going to be a happy, everybody peaceful place. It is already a contested place. So what is happening? That's one judgment in terms of what's happening. And second, how do we respond to the evolution of this military contestation, and what are our interests, and how do we secure our interests in the new contestation, military contestation for dominance in outer space? That I think is a very, very important task, I think, which we need to look at. That brings me to the eighth set of issues, which is more on the civilian side. For example, is space meant for if you read the Outer Space Treaty, which talks about space is the province of all mankind. Just as you remember, we said the oceans were global commons, that space is the province of all mankind. Space, as you know, stirs great rhetoric, high ideals. Always, from the very beginning, outer space generated this immense sense of grandiose notions of what humanity, and we think of humanity as a whole, what it needs to do, how it needs to connect with this. Because even remember, during the Cold War, US and Russia, whenever they wanted to show they committed to peace, they would cooperate in space. A whole lot of activity, even at the height of the Cold War, took place in space. But yet today, the commercialization of space is going to undermine the notion that this is there for everyone. That is, many countries are beginning to challenge the Outer Space Treaty. I'll give you an example of two tiny countries. One is Luxembourg. Luxembourg is not even as big as Lutyens Delhi, or even probably even smaller than that. Set up a new space law that allows the private sector companies registered in Luxembourg to exploit moon and outer space. The United Arab Emirates is doing the same. They're setting up a space law so that companies can register in Luxembourg or Abu Dhabi and say, look, we are these actors. So there is a conflict between outer space law, the existing law, which says nobody should appropriate, space is not for national appropriation, while countries are beginning to create national laws, including Trump administration too has passed something to that effect, that actually your companies are today capable of, are legally permitted to exploit outer space, whether it is for minerals, whether it is for building a space power station, what have you, or exploiting resources out of asteroids. You can think of all kinds of things, which all seem very crazy at this point, but not so crazy in 5 or 10 years down the road. Therefore, that the rule of what was designed in 1967 when the Outer Space Treaty was negotiated, and the scale of the commercial activity today, presents a fundamental conflict between the Outer Space Treaty and the principle of a province of all mankind. And this is going to create, that is one that tells you urgency. You need a space law, and you need to cope with these fundamental changes that are taking place in the nature of law and governance of outer space. And therefore, you got to address that challenge in the tension between national appropriation versus the principle of global commons that has existed. That brings me to the ninth point. If the Outer Space Treaty is outlived its utility, nobody's saying that, but quite clearly everyone is trying to find loopholes within the Outer Space Treaty to do the kind of things. For example, and even a principle, as all of you know, which seems absolutely rational, equitable, in practice can be turned into something inequitable. For example, the Outer Space Treaty says, okay, if India is setting up a little space station in Moon, and others who come later should not interfere with the existing operation on the Moon. Now, if that is the rule, so I go into space, I threw a huge kind of wire, communication wire, and say, look, all this is, I'm working on it. So tomorrow, if someone else wants to come in, you say, no, that is interfering in my activities in outer space. And you can say Moon looks pretty big and nice, but there are only few areas which are where there is water And it's precisely those areas where the contest is going to take place. For landing, for activity, human activity, for setting up bases, for factories, whatever you want to talk. So the principles of Outer Space Treaty and the Moon Treaty, which seem reasonable, fair, at a time when nobody was going to do anything in outer space. So therefore it looked fine. But today people have the capacity to do things. Therefore you need new rules of the road. So who is going to draw the new rules of the road? Are we going to go back to the UN and say, look, let's draft a new outer space treaty? Or do you say, look, I and my like-minded friends will come together and we agree on some rules, which is what the US is now trying to do under the so-called Artemis Accords for Moon. And they say, look, we all are spacefaring nations, so let's come together and set up certain set of rules of how to organize human activity in outer space, on the Moon. Russia and China are going to do their own thing. They're not going to accept what these guys say. In fact, Russia and China probably at this point seem a bit ahead. So therefore, you have actually geopolitics. When you talk about geo is land and earth. So this is still, when we talk about geopolitics outer space, this is still about the geopolitics on earth. That the contestation among the powers on the earth will have an effect on how Moon and other celestial bodies are going to be managed. Therefore, drafting these new rules. So where is India going to be in drafting these new rules? Are we simply going to say outer space treaty is the greatest thing? There can be nothing better than that. Or do we say, do we work with our partners? Or do we say, let's go back to the UN and put it in a committee? 65 countries will negotiate for the next 100 years of what the rules are. Meanwhile, things are happening on the ground. But we need to ask ourselves, what are our interests? How are we going to secure our interests at a time when the basic principles of governing outer space are fundamentally up for grabs? So I think that is the challenge. And that brings me to the last point, which is really that if commerce, military use, and the nature of outer space is profoundly being changed amidst a larger number of countries operating, what should be India's strategy in outer space? Do we stick to non-alignment, self-reliance, and the solo strategy in space? Or do we say we create coalitions, we create alliances? I mean, this is not a comfortable question, but can you do it on your own? Do you just keep doing things on our own? And we say, look, I'm alone. I'm a lone ranger. I'm not going to work with anybody else. Or do you say what China is doing today is too complicated? I don't have the resources to match it. Or do I work with someone else? Just as we're doing today in the Indo-Pacific, we are working with the Americans. We're working with, at a time we never used to work with them. But today, the scale of the Chinese challenge is leading us towards finding partners. So do we find partners? What should be the nature of those partnerships? If we assuming we need partnerships. These are big questions. And I think those of you who saw the Quad joint statement when President Biden, Morrison, and the Suga, the Japanese Prime Minister at that time, there is a whole paragraph on outer space and the need to work together. But I think the leaders have said there is something here to be done, but I've seen very little debate in our strategic community. What does that mean? What should be the terms of our partnership with others if we need to do partnership? So therefore, the question of alliances, coalitions becomes a very important one if India has to be in the game in outer space. That will be a challenge. So let me conclude this talk by mainly affirming the broad lessons which I think are important. I'd love to hear what you think, because you're far more engaged with the issues on a far more direct basis. One is really space is being democratized. You're going to see a lot more countries. Two, private sector, commercial use of space are dramatically going to increase. And that space within our domestic debate, it can't be just the preserve of one department, but it must bring together all national stakeholders. And that fourth, it should not be focused on prestige, but pragmatism and national purpose should guide our space program. That international cooperation must be a new element. That is the fifth point we made in our larger strategy. Reconcile to the emerging militarization and weaponization of outer space, and that we need an active military space program. And that we need to, seventh, we need to think about the nature of outer space. What would be India's theory of space as a military domain? Do you have a theory of the case? We don't at this point. And I think we need to develop the theory of the case. What is it that we want to see? And what is it that we can do in outer space? Then the eighth question, I mean, that the idea of global commons, the province of mankind, a space as a province of mankind, is under stress. Then if national appropriation is going to come, what are the rules, new rules of the road that we need to negotiate? And then if new rules are necessary, how are we going to do it? Are we going to do it through alliances, coalitions, or acting alone, just adapting ourselves without reference to the others? So I think these are all big, important questions as space becomes important. And I think my sense is, let me just say at the end that here again, you as aerospace professionals, and I think have a big task in educating the rest of the society on the need to take a fresh look at space and think of it in an integrated and comprehensive manner. So I'll stop here.